Welcome to Surviving Society.
Hi everyone, it is Ez and welcome to season 2 of The Role of Love in Social Justice Work. I am joined today with Alex Rajinder Mason.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm based in Sheffield. I work for the University of Sheffield Centre for Equity and Inclusion. I also project manage Dig Where You Stand, which is an archival justice project, again, based in Sheffield.
I met Alex through actually last year's series on this same topic. Alex reached out to Surviving Society to see if there was anyone that could kind of speak at an event that you were putting on in Sheffield about the role of love in social justice work. And so we were connected through that. I felt really positively challenged by just the whole kind of trajectory of our relationship from the very beginning. I felt it was one that really centered like critical analysis of what love is, and also there was a deep level of care that I felt from you, even before we'd met on Zoom or even in person. There was like a process of checking in that I felt through, that felt really loving actually, and then the event was amazing, which we'll speak about, I'm sure. Just again, being in the space with you, running the workshop with students as well, and just kind of really being able to see the practice and praxis of love in your work. And yeah, I thought, why not kick off with you as the first guest for this series?
Sounds great. And I've said to you before, I feel like I've known you for a lot longer than I actually have. So I'm always happy to get into some conversation with you. So yeah, really looking forward to it.
Brilliant, thanks Alex. And yeah, same for me. And actually I'm gonna unpick that a little bit, because there's something for me about when love is both named, when there is an intention about love, it's almost like a portal into a space of vulnerability that allows the work to be grounded or rooted in something. So like when you say that you feel like you've known me for a lot longer, I can definitely say I feel the same. But I think I guess I've got questions around, would that have been different if the first thing that we worked on together or spoke about wasn't love? I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I suppose in some regards, I knew you before you knew me because I listened to your first podcast series, which was why I invited you to that event. And one of the things I remember most, I suppose, is your openness in those conversations, and use the words vulnerability. I would say that too. It's always, for me, easier to connect with someone who you know is going to be open and vulnerable in conversation, particularly around quite tricky subject matters, like love and social justice. It feels like a risky place to put yourself and to try and work through what you understand by those two things, because the stakes feel quite high. So in hearing how you conducted those conversations and how you put so much of yourself into them, I think already that for me was kind of building some sense of connection with you. But I think you're right that I suppose when we met and spoke properly, the topic was necessarily love, because the event was love and social justice. And I think I consider myself a fairly open person too, and so I was quite happy to share my reflections on those topics. You got to feel pretty bonded to be able to kind of work through those two things in a first meeting. It's not your usual kind of initial networking event, say.
Yeah, no, that really resonates. And I always forget with this podcasting thing, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's true, people do have a perception or perspective, or there is a level of connection that people feel or have with me through podcasting. So that's interesting as well. I think there's something about, but I also think that there's lots of people that would have listened to that series and it not land. And that's, I'm very aware, particularly in kind of the academic space. I think there's lots of people that wouldn't have necessarily resonated with them. So I think there's something for me, and like we'll speak a little bit more as we go about the importance of this for me, and the importance of this, in my view, for the social justice space in general. I think there's something about the willingness to be open, but also to connect with it's going to sound a bit airy-fairy, but to just find your tribe in this work and like actually who are the people, because for many people there are people in social justice spaces that rightly or wrongly, for better or for worse, are coming at it from a different angle. And this isn't these topics of love or the importance of love or loving practice, for whatever reason, aren't central to how they engage with social justice, social change. Just I think there's something about the importance of figuring out who your tribe is in, and like when you're networking and when you're doing this work. For me, it is imperative that we're able to be, I'll speak in that I am able to be myself. I have to be able to feel loved and love to do it. Otherwise, what am I doing? Is kind of how I look at it.
Again, my introduction to you as someone who's pursuing greater understanding of this connection between love and social justice. I mean, that's a pretty admirable pursuit to be on. And so already, I felt drawn to you, someone who would have that at the forefront of their mind. There's also an element of serendipity that I was just thinking about as you were talking, in that this event that we did around love and social justice, we had literally decided the theme, I think, 2 weeks or so before I saw that this series was out. You mentioned about finding your tribe, and there's a sense, I think, that you find some people at the right time, maybe on a similar path, or even at different stages, but you're in that same pursuit as one another, and there's something quite exciting about that. And I think that's probably part of it too. It's really hard working within an institution to find anyone who would take these topics seriously. It's a really horrible place to be most of the time, I find, university. And I've been there for 12, 13 odd years now, same institution. I think it goes for all of them, in the UK. Mm-hmm. So to find someone who is taking that topic seriously, is trying to undo these harmful systems, and is doing it at the same time that you're trying to do it as well, that's something to get excited about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that you decided on that. And actually, I don't think I'd thought about it. Like, what was your process into even doing the event? And that serendipitous piece, I think, has been my experience of my career just across the board. I think there's always been, and when you're in pursuit of doing this work in a way that centres love and community, I think there just always has been that person or those people or that group or that organisation or whatever it is that at the right time I've found that supports me in developing my practice, that supports me in kind of moving along with whatever the thing is at that time. Yeah, so we're speaking a little bit about our relationship in that journey, but yeah, let's speak more about the event. Let's broaden that out a bit for listeners to think, because I haven't even heard this. So what was kind of your process to putting on the event about love and social justice in Sheffield?
It somewhat goes to my role within this Centre for Equity and Inclusion, which is a fairly new thing at the university. It's working with PhD students of colour, but also community partners across Sheffield to think about, to address systemic racism, both within higher education and beyond it, and to try and do things differently. I wouldn't consider it an EDI initiative. I would consider it as something that's really focused on justice. Mm-hmm. With that, then we wanted to introduce different topics. We wanted to engage with those topics in new and hopefully transformative ways. I used to do research, and my research was in race, higher education and the arts, and I became quite interested in this notion of assemblage, to consider an institution as comprised of a series of assemblages that currently manifest in this really harmful way. But in a hopeful sense, if you can sort of modify that assemblage, create new assemblages, you ultimately end up with a different environment. Mm. I suppose part of my hope for this centre was that we would, by working with PhD students of colour, by working with community partners in new ways, we might be able to shift some of these assemblages and make it a better environment. And so in our first year, we focused on the theme Imagining Otherwise, which was based on the book by Lola Olufemi, because I found her play with form to be kind of aligned with this sense of thinking about new assemblages. When we had that event, there was lots of different sharings during the creative sort of exercises that we ran. And when it came to preparing for the second event, we wanted to go through those creative sharings and see if there were any prompts for what the second theme for the second year should be. So to quite literally build on the earlier conversations, because I really don't like it when events and projects sort of drop off. You do them once and then you move to something else. I like the idea of a sustained conversation. And so the thing that really jumped out to me and the team was one comment really that was talking about how love had to be centered if we were trying to imagine otherwise. And that's where it came from. I mean, I'd read my bell hooks, so you know, I'd somewhat kind of introduced myself to the concept a bit, but I think it excited people to see love talked about in that context, to have some kind of lay sense of what love meant, but to know also that they hadn't really considered it in a social justice framework at any length. And as I say, read a bit of bell hooks. I never really sat with it that much. So it really seemed to invigorate the team, and we decided that would be the theme. But crucially, we thought if we're talking about love, or love is the centerpiece of this event, it can't just be a panel discussion of academics. It had to be the format had to reflect a love ethic. And so we wanted to get artists, performers, we wanted to get a space that felt warm and loving, and we wanted to kind of facilitate critical but creative conversation and connection. So that was kind of the context for that event.
I'm thinking a few things. I think the first thing is just how the word that came to my head is progressive, which I also now want to puke at because I don't, that's definitely not the word, but something, just how like important it is to have people within institutions that are thinking in these ways, because I don't think that that's the norm. I don't think that people, even what you said about having an event that and then dropping off, but that actually the importance of kind of listening to feedback and engaging with the community that you are representing. I think there's something about that is like feels really powerful. And then I think the theme coming directly from a comment that came out of your first event, and then the curiosity. So you weren't going in saying, "Oh, I'm an expert on love." You were actually saying, "Oh, this is something that I actually don't. I could upskill on. This is something that actually I haven't given enough critical engagement or thought to, and so I want to be in community and figure this out." And again, I'm going to design this in a way, I work with the team to design this in a way that represents the love ethic. That feels really important, and I'm kind of outlining that process for anybody listening that works in institutions that is having a similar desire to engage more with some of these topics. And I think one of my concerns, fears is probably more accurate, of doing this series last year was, like, is it too fluffy? Like, is it too fluffy to be taken seriously, particularly for Surviving Society's audience? But at the same time, it was just like, no, this is so important. And like, yeah, everyone's read a bit about hooks, but no one, we kind of, people read all about love or whatever it is, read that series, and then I can't see how that's integrated into theory and practice around this topic. So yeah, I found your process really, what is the word I'm thinking of? Just like important is probably it. Just an important way to have engaged with this and to bring it forward. And then I'll speak about my experience of the event. So, and I'll speak about the pre and then the actual event itself. But I guess I always kind of feel out, like whenever there's like bits of work that aren't long-term pieces, I kind of feel out, is this something that feels aligned to where I'm at and what I want to do, basically. And just again from our initial conversations, and also I will say this out loud, there's something as well about like my own maybe imposter syndrome, or my own critical analysis of self, is, am I best placed to have this conversation, which comes up a lot for me in academic spheres, definitely. And so I was like, I don't know. It kind of came into our initial conversations. I don't know. I know that the title definitely is appealing to me, but I don't know if like how we will work on this, my perceptions or what I bring will suit this audience. But it became really apparent to me really early on, just through our interactions, that, oh no, this isn't business as usual. And again, I want to highlight that for anybody that works in institutions, that if you're to kind of engage people, that I wouldn't be interested in being one panelist that is speaking kind of from the perspective that I'm speaking, if it was a panel of academics that were talking from a different place. And that's not to say that there isn't room for engaging with this topic in different ways, but I guess it was really clear really early on to me that there was going to be kind of a diverse approach to how we explore this, and it wasn't just going to centre academic knowledge in what we see as important. So that felt really important. And then the event itself, I was really blown away. So I knew it was going to be good because we'd worked on it and we'd been in conversation for quite a while leading up to it. I was like, okay, I kind of felt intuitively that this was going to be something that would centre community in ways that feel important. What I think I underestimated, and this is, I'm going to show my ignorance here, but I think there is so much work being done in Sheffield that just from my perspective, my kind of exposure to it, didn't know any of that stuff was happening. So it was like, just to be in a space where actually it actually felt like a really advanced space. It felt like a lot of the people, and even the kind of people that attended that weren't a part of the team or weren't a part of the university or any of the partners that you'd worked with, it just felt like the space, even, was it called Utopia Building?
Utopia Theatre.
Utopia Theatre. So even just the physical space, even just like how, there was a strong sense of love and community in that space. And just speaking to people and the other people that spoke, I was just like, oh, this is not work that's starting today. This is being built on. And I also felt that, yes, we might be naming it. Now I think the only difference is maybe when we're naming how this relates to love. But I think that there is clearly like connections that have been existing for a long time. And I really, really, really felt that on the day. And I spoke about love from quite a hard-hitting place. I think what I shared, I spoke from a personal place, but I also spoke about some of the harsher edges of love and what that looks like, or what that has looked like for me in my practice, and the importance of being able to engage with that. And I was coming in, I was like, oh, is this going to land, or is this going to be a bit too much? But actually, I felt that people really engaged with that. And again, I think that was testimony to the space being as open and as held and as carefully curated as it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing to hear that was your experience. Because I'm a project manager. That's my role within the centre. And the thing I would say, this was one event that lasted, 3 hours? We were planning it for a year. And I think, like, I'm glad that you're saying that, because I think it shows that planning time was worth it. I mean, obviously, we're planning many other things as well. But the time allowed, I think, to kind of really think through decisions. From what you're saying and from what others have said, it paid off. I mean, even in terms of the venue, I had the relationship with that venue, Utopia Theatre. I've worked with them a fair few times, but my organising team are really, really keen, and they're all PhD students, really keen to ensure we made this event as open and accessible as possible. So we spent some time working with the venue, talking about what are your current accessibility measures, what can we be doing collectively to ensure it's even more accessible, how do we communicate that to anyone who's going to be coming. That's just one example that took a few months to figure out, and all the different touches that I think ultimately made it a successful event. It was because of the time we spent together talking about it. And I think you talked about the importance of engaging with a topic that we weren't expert on. I think that was important. I think the best thing, I'm a pretty mediocre researcher. I think I learned that during my time doing a PhD, that I love researching and I love sitting with concepts, but in terms of like actually being an academic, pretty average. But I think it was the best thing for me, because I think I'm quite open to not knowing. I'm quite comfortable with the limits of perhaps my ability to take a concept further. So I'm always looking for people that are going to help me along. I often like to wrestle with or pick concepts for events that I don't have much of a sense of. And we've talked about how that drove this decision here. But it was the same for the team. And so we spent a lot of time talking theoretically about love, trying to pin it down, trying to understand different definitions around it. We set up a discussion group for other PhD students to join us in the build up to the event. And that theoretical conversation was feeding into the decisions made for how the event should look. So if something came up that we felt might play in, we would act upon it. And that was for us taking theory into praxis, which is what people are always saying should be done. That was our version of it. And the thing is, there's something else that you mentioned earlier, which I think is relevant about will love feel woolly for kind of a social science context. To me, love and social justice is such a challenge. It's asking so much of you to bring those two things together. In those discussion groups, in exploring love, we then took the question to, does the university reflect a love ethic? And if it doesn't, what would it take to make it so? And genuinely, it felt like the entire system of the university would have to change. It would have to be completely dismantled and built again for it to contain this love ethic that we were working towards. That is a really difficult thing to wrestle with. It's not woolly at all. It's a real challenge to anyone who's trying to make systemic changes. But all of that conversation then, this is a one-off event. There's only so much you can do. But I think the energy of trying to respond to that challenge was perhaps what was felt in that room. And the audiences who were involved in the conversations, they're all doing that work in their own spaces outside the institution. And they're all trying to take up that challenge. They're really trying to make change, basically, in Sheffield. And the brilliant thing about Sheffield is that it's a fairly small city. It's quite easy to build connections and alliances and feel like you're part of a broader movement. It's not always easy sustaining them, but what is the community feel is quite strong in Sheffield, at least in my experience.
Yeah,
so,
I definitely felt that too in the 2 days that I was with you guys. Yeah.
So yeah, that was my feeling.
I think, Alex, there were two main things that kind of came up for me when you were just speaking there. One of them is just love ethic takes time and intention. And so I think there's developing a love ethic is like, it's a skill. It's something that takes time. And I think actually a challenge that I have in my work is that, and particularly like my consultancy work, is that actually in order to kind of deliver on, quote unquote, some of the things that organizations ask from me, I need to be in relationship. And there needs to be time. And so like that, and there isn't always time. And so it's recognizing that actually the time and intention is one of the most kind of important ways it's the only way to kind of really develop a love ethic. And then I think that leads into the second thing that was coming up for me about the limitations. Just like you're working within systems, structures, institutions there are such limitations to this work in these spaces, in this way, in this world, in our communities, in this country. It's like there are so many limitations, but we do it anyway. We kind of have to, like, it's like, what's the alternative is the question that I have. So if we aren't going to do it in this way, what is the alternative? And I think there's something about that as well that's really popping up for me.
So slowing down feels vital, and I probably had one of the most intensive 12 months that I've ever experienced. And this event came, right in the middle of it. Coming out of that really intensive time, I completely agree. Slowing down has to be part of this pursuit for a love ethic. Or in fact, when people say that they can't do something anymore or that they need to take time away, so the thing that we were working on might have to be postponed or whatever, my going along with that, my encouragement of that, I think is sometimes the best example of living a love ethic. Encouraging people to slow down, move away, take time off, pause a project, whatever. It's so important because anytime someone decides to slow down, that's helping us all. That's resetting a culture for us all. And we've talked a lot about this, outside of this particular recorded conversation, but there's something about giving yourself that time to slow and sit with yourself and contemplate your own being, that then affords you the tools to do this work better. And the institution that I'm part of, and I would imagine most institutions don't operate in that way at all. It's you're working full pelt week after week after week. If you get a gap of time, you're encouraged to fill it with something else. The work is never done. But there's no time to pause and think about what have you just done? How can you work on yourself? How can you improve yourself? How can you get in touch with different aspects of yourself that aren't being foregrounded in this particular institutional workplace? And that for me has become really important, and certainly part of any love ethic that I'll be pursuing, certainly beyond that event, and just generally going forward.
It is that, like, actually, how are we being our own guinea pigs? So it's like, actually, that I can read a book and teach the love stuff, or I can think about love and think about like how we develop particular cultures, of ways of being together in community in our practice, blah blah blah. But actually, where I receive the most insight is in those moments that I take for myself, where I'm able to reflect, where there is that space to really reflect on my practice, to really develop relationships, to really explore what's going on for me, what I'm bringing, so that I'm not just in a heady place. Because I think the heady place is important to like the knowledge and the critical analysis. I think it is important. I think it does move us forward. But actually, I've found in my own work that there are times where I'm just saying things, but what I'm saying is disconnected from my truth in that moment. And I think I've wrestled a lot with that, particularly around accountability and anger, where it's like, actually, I'm angry and that anger looks a particular way for me. Anger might look, and I need the space to be in that truth, but in a way that is loving. There are accountability conversations that I need to have with people about how I've felt that I'm being treated, or how I've been spoken to, or how someone's way of engaging with me has taken me out of of the ability to feel safe and continue in the work with them, and vice versa. Like, how am I creating space to be held accountable? And all of that for me comes with time and space. So like, things are happening when you're working in community, things happen, and like, I think that it's really important for me to kind of know what's going on for myself, so that what I'm bringing to a space, what I'm bringing to a relationship / organisation / any of my work, what I'm bringing to that space is reflective of the truth of where I'm at.
So as you were talking, I was thinking about the workshop that you led after the event, and the focus that you had on play, because you've been talking about the fact that theory and the kind of knowledge side of love is important, and it can help move things along, but there's a need to kind of engage with other elements of love. But to do that, you really need to be given the space, given the tools to explore those other facets. And play, whilst it seems simple, was such a transformative way of doing it. Coming into a university amongst PhD students who have all of those things around imposter syndrome, and trying to, by and large, operate in a way they expect academics to operate. It's a very strange stage of kind of research to be in. You're no longer a student. You're an aspiring academic, but you're not quite an academic either. And it's very easy then to fall within these sort of conventional patterns, and emphasizing theory, and emphasizing kind of, I guess, rational thought. But we spend probably half of that workshop playing a game, and it immediately prevents you from, when you're coming in, I'm coming to this love and social justice. I've got all these ideas about what it means and the definitions and how I enact it and how we can change the university, but we're going to play a game. So all of that goes. You're just playing a game, and you're having fun, and then you forget that you're in a workshop. And I think that then, because we obviously then went in to talk about the subject, but I think in playing for so long, it didn't even take us to a place we'd never been before. It reminded us actually that, we're playful beings. Not only have we been kids, we play
Mm-hmm.
now as adults, but just less than we should.
Mm-hmm.
And we also don't play often in our institutions. So what you were doing really was kind of allowing these two different ways of being to meet together in this one space. And that's what I was saying earlier, I think, about trying to create a format that allows for a more not advanced so much, but richer and deeper exploration of love.
Mm-hmm.
And play to me was vital. I often lean on the arts because I mean, the arts itself allows for greater play. But it just takes you away from that heady space.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, so I thought that was really important and allows you to kind of touch on those emotions a little bit more directly. And also in terms of building relationships, we've talked before about kind of the reciprocal um, the need to kind of think about love in a reciprocal manner
Mm-hmm.
and to center relationships as opposed to just building um, theory and practice more abstractly.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I think that play was a really important way of doing that you introduced to us.
Yeah, thanks for that reflection. I think it was a judgment call as well on the day, because I remember it was like, I realised for different reasons that, okay, the plan wasn't going to go perfectly to plan. So it's like, actually, what do we prioritise here? And it just felt important because actually the truth is I felt a slight resistance from the students at the beginning of that. And I was like, oh, there's something here. Like, how can we stick with this and stay with this? And what will come out of that? And again, that could have gone very differently. Thankfully, I think it did kind of land, and it did kind of link in with the topics of conversation that we were having afterwards. But I think, yeah, the willingness to even be in that place, I think there's something vulnerable about play. Play in particularly in the context of university students, and like, this isn't, you're not with your friends, you're not with your family. There is like an element of that, oh, how much can I lean into this? But I think it feels important to challenge ourselves in all the different ways that we can. And I think when I think about the academy, I think I don't think people actually challenge themselves. I think people stick to a lane and learn that lane and then just get better at that thing. But actually to be in, and then their ideas can be great, but actually those ideas are not practiced, or those ideas, there's such a dissonance between the thinking and the environment. And so whenever I go into those spaces, and similar with like the topics that I chose for the event, I'll admit, when I wrote that, I thought that there would be a much more academic audience, like it would be a lot more, and like there was a mix. There were people there from that space, but I was like, actually, I want this to be hard hitting. I want people to hear what the experience in my world is, that might be very different to what they're expecting to hear. And I think that it's important to offer that challenge and to see how people can meet you there or not. And what you do with that also feels important. So yeah, I was really grateful for the workshop space, which was a different space to the event. And again, I think it was a testament to your hard work in cultivating that space and leading that space in a way that people felt able to even step into what they were being asked.
There's something here about grounding ourselves and each other. Again, going back to the playfulness, it encouraged us to actually take in the space where we were situated and each other, because in playing, in that invitation to be silly, and to laugh with one another and even at each other, in a gentle sense, we were being drawn to each other, I think, where when it's just a kind of conventional conversation where someone asks a prompt and then someone's invited to answer, even if you're sat in a group, often it feels like you're kind of sat fairly rigidly. You may kind of, as you're trying to think things through, you're kind of not particularly focusing on who's around you, the immediate environment, and it becomes heady. Whereas play, because it's because it's encouraging this greater connection to your body, to other bodies, it almost takes away a veil, I suppose, which I think the institution puts on. It's a reminder that, oh, these are all people that are around me. This is all space that I'm inhabiting, and I suppose even more simply, uh, I'm here too. And this is something that I've been trying to, we talked about this recently. I've been trying to connect with more, is presence. And I think that would be another word that I would foreground in the conversation around love ethics is presence. Trying to be present and trying to encourage presence in others, and that playfulness, it has to encourage, and not necessary for play, I think, is presence. Even if the game can be quite, fantastical, I do think that there's an element of presence, of being in your body at that particular moment, and being in the immediacy of that moment, not thinking before or after. So I think there's an issue within institutions and maybe universities specifically about not finding space to ground yourself and others. And without that, it's very difficult to go into these conversations around love in any way that isn't just kind of theoretical, and that isn't lived in practice. So trying to find different ways to ground ourselves within these institutions, I think, is important, and to be present.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and I think that I can definitely see how that's reflected in the charity and social change world too, whereas that actually there isn't real space allocated to ground and be present with what is, because often people are working in firefighter mode, so people are trying to put out fires, things are really urgent, people are underfunded, all of the context isn't changing, and that's the unfortunate truth. But it's like and something that I've struggled with in recent years is like, well, okay, so what do we do with that? Like, I can't continue to work in this way. And actually a lot of what drove me to this kind of pursuit of understanding love in a deeper way was that experience of that. I can't work in this way, particularly someone that lives with all the intersecting identities that I live with. It's like, this isn't loving, this isn't sustainable, this isn't this isn't going to work. I'm not going to be able to do this for much longer. And so when I think about the role of play and the role of presence and grounding and all of that stuff, it's not floaty. Like, I get in my head a bit. I'm like, is it too floaty, or is it? No, this is actually just a sustainable mechanism to do this work well, and to do this work well over time in a way that causes little harm as possible. Whenever I'm in conversations, or like whenever I'm developing relationships, basically it's the only way to do it. It's the only way to do this well, in my view. It's the only way to do it is to actually intentionally create space for presence, create space for play and embodied connection with self, with community. That's the only way this works well in my experience.
For those who are interested in social justice, is to develop models, frameworks, whatever you want to call them, that allow that to happen. Because I've said, like, when we were talking about in the discussion groups around what is love and what's the connection between love and social justice and how does it apply to university, the feeling was that the university was so far away from being a loving environment that you'd have to basically start again. So we really do need to come up with some different ways of being, some different orientations, some different assemblages, frameworks that allow a greater facilitation of this love ethic, of this loving environment to thrive. So that's a really valuable use of time. And that's something that in my work increasingly within the centre, beyond the centre, is trying to work with various community groups, partners, collaborators on specific models that we can then share to hopefully kind of present new ways of working together, new ways of communing together. We've looked at kind of the legal frameworks that tend to, in a university context, kind of shape how relationships form. So partnership agreements, universities often will use them with any external collaborator. and that becomes the benchmark for the relationship that you're going to be involved with. And when you look at it, it's so suspicious, it's so punitive. It's basically trying to protect the university against any potential wrongdoing that the collaborator might have. That is not the basis of a loving relationship and then a loving piece of work that's supposed to come from it. So what we set out to do effectively as soon as the centre launched actually was to create our own we didn't call it a loving partnership agreement. It was called an anti-racist partnership agreement, but the ethos of it basically was to how do we remove that kind of punitive element, that suspicion, and how do we actually center relationships that are principally concerned with connection, about coming together, about mutually enhancing, I suppose, each other as individuals, each other as organizations, whatever it might be. But it was about that reciprocity. And I think it would, even if it wasn't explicitly mentioned, I think it was about building love between those two entities, whether it was the institution or an individual academic and a partner. And what we did was we drew from kind of our own different cultural reference points, and we had people doing this piece of work from all over the world. And we reimagined all of these legal clauses so that they would center connection and relationships. And things like where in the original document it'd be talking about finance and payment and how this money would be owed, and if it wasn't paid, then it would be this issue and there would be this ramification. We talked about payment is nourishment. Let's focus on nourishment. We, in entering into this work and receiving remuneration for it, what we are committing to is nourishing one another. There are certain things for you to thrive as a person in the world, you need to be nourished, and payment is going to go towards that nourishment. Whether that's paying, that might be paying for a bill for shelter, adequate shelter, say, but it comes down to nourishment. This isn't like a really cold and hard exchange that you're lucky to get if you're a community partner from an institution who often seem loath to pay anyone for anything. It comes back to it's about nourishment, and so this agreement was sort of saying, let's nourish one another, let's build a connection off of that, and that was kind of our clause around finance and payment. So just maybe one example of just how we were trying to shift ways of thinking about very conventional, standardized clauses, ways of working, in that university context.
Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, language is really important, and the feel of language. So even as you're saying nourishment, that I feel something totally different around finance than I do when you're talking about if you don't pay, if you don't adhere to this and that, you will be it just feels different. It's a different feel as I'm entering that relationship, which doesn't mean that you don't have the necessary boundaries in place, but I guess it's a more relational way of working. And when you were speaking, I know you said that you called it an anti-racist partnership. What was it called? Sorry,
partnership agreement.
Yeah, partnership agreement. When you were saying it was partly tongue in cheek, but it's like, actually, isn't that a synonym for love? And so thinking about language, thinking about these ways, love. Yes, that's a word that I use often, but I recognise some people are uncomfortable or don't necessarily. That is a difficult entry point for some in the context of their work. But it is like, okay, so what is the practice of love that applies to whatever context you're in? For some people, they're not going to be able to turn around and say love in their particular context, even if this resonates. But it's thinking, okay, is it anti-racist work? Is it anti-oppressive work? And what is the relationship between those things? If you're saying you're doing that work, have you explored the relationship between those things and love in practice? And if you haven't, how can you think a little bit more intentionally about that? I just wanted to touch on one more thing before we round up, because there was another point that felt quite pivotal in our relationship that just came to my mind as we were talking earlier. And there's something about that challenge and positive challenge. So I'm not going to talk about who or what, but there was a controversial thing happening, and I'd seen you put a tweet out about this controversial thing, and it wasn't that I didn't agree with what you said, it's that I had questions around it. And I think in this age of social media, in this age of like that, especially when it's like in the social justice world, people putting out statements around things. This has been a real theme with organisations that I've worked with, and some of the challenges around that. And I guess what I recognised was that was a moment of curiosity for me that I really wanted to lean into and speak to you about. And it was more like, I don't know what you mean when you say this thing. But I would like to know more about what you mean when you say the thing. Hopefully, I'm trying to not talk about what it was because I don't want to get into that, and so hopefully this isn't too abstract for listeners. But yeah, so I did reach out and I was like, "Can we have a chat about this?" I saw you put a tweet out about this. Can we have a chat about it? And then we had a phone call, and I found just the phone call was really eye opening for me for a few reasons. One, I think it really confirmed it confirmed something about just how open you are to challenge, and and the importance of that for being in a relationship that feels authentic. So if we haven't worked on anything since that, but my hope is that we will in future. But that, again, there was a practice of that, okay, what would it look like if and when there's, and I'm not even going to call it disagreement, but if and when that does happen. So there was that. I think there's also something about, I think it really made me question my relationship with social media and the relationship between social media, social justice and love, and that actually what is the link between some of those different things. I know that in recent times that has been a real challenge for institutions, organisations, how they engage in the online space, can either encourage more loving practice or move people away from that. So there was just something about that interaction in terms of the trajectory of our relationship that felt really grounding, that we could have that, rather than if I had seen it and not engaged, what would that have done for our trajectory if I had seen it, kind of had certain views on it and then not engaged. So there was just something about that I wanted to kind of name and think through, that what is the relationship between love, social media, loving practice, social media and social justice.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is not related, but I've come off Twitter now and all social media pretty much. The only access I have to social media is for kind of organizations that I might be kind of helping to manage. Because for my own self anyway, I did find it quite an inauthentic space to be. I mean, it's been a really overwhelming space to be in as well. Of late, perhaps it always was, but I found it particularly difficult this sort of calendar year. But I felt myself having an inauthentic relationship with it. You're so conscious that for me, and let me speak for myself. I was so self-conscious about anything I would post. Always thinking about the potential reader. And even in this particular instance that you're talking about, I felt compelled to say something because it was quite related to my own research area. Otherwise, I don't feel like my opinion is that worth sharing in that platform. But I felt like if I didn't say something, that in itself is kind of saying something. And then I'm playing all these mind games with myself about this imagined audience and what they're expecting of me, and probably no one even cares, but it just was taking me to places that I thought were really unhelpful. I find on the flip side though, those that particular phone conversations, but subsequent phone conversations as well, are so much more authentic. I think you can really get to grips with a topic in not only in a more authentic way, but in a richer way, in a way that seems to get much closer to truth. And probably I've been having more of those kinds of conversations in my kind of work, but also in just my general day to day, that it made me think that I didn't particularly need social media. I think the reason that social media was appealing to me initially was because within the university, within this institution, I felt such a lack of like-valued people, where I couldn't have those sorts of open conversations where there was challenge. You know, for an academic institution, there is such a lack of challenge because people don't seem that bothered about the topic, or that engaged in the topic, if we're regarding racial justice anyway. For all the workshops on decolonization that run. So I went to social media because I knew that there were like-valued people across the country and internationally who I could connect with. But just of late, it felt like I feel like there's been a shift on something like Twitter anyway, generally beyond any individuals.
Yeah.
But also just it wasn't feeding me anymore. And I think those authentic conversations for me happen elsewhere at this point. But yeah, I think, in terms of continuing the work from that event between the two of us, those phone calls have been some of the most formative phone calls that I've had, even our one recently. It really then goes on to shape how I view things, how I put into practice the next thing that I'm doing up in Sheffield. So to some extent, I see that as part of a collaboration as much as the one-off event that we did earlier in the year.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for both of those points, because I do think that there is something about working together in a way that, one, isn't transactional, and two, that allows space for authentic connection and joint growth. I definitely really value the conversations that we have as well, and they just get me thinking in a very different way about things that maybe that I'm in the practice of, that kind of feel almost second nature. At some point it becomes a bit like that, but to have a conversation with someone that's on a similar journey but in a totally different context, in all the different ways, both identity wise, regions, but all of that stuff, there's kind of seeing where there's overlap has felt really important. And yeah, on the social media piece, it's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing question that I have in my head. Like, what is the role of social media? What do I want to do? Because me, on Twitter, people that follow me know I just kind of say what it's lyrics, or it's just, I steer away from the what people would expect, kind of the more social commentary. I steer away from social commentary. I don't think that is the most useful space for that. I might have my day or my moment but even then, it's like, actually, how are we promoting a love ethic in the online space as well? And there's something about, there's just questions more than answers about safety, but then that being said, I think there is a flip side of that, where there is, like you've mentioned, massive opportunity for connection, both nationally, internationally, about topics that are important. So it's just, I think I do at some point want to think a little bit more critically about what that means in the context of love. So thanks for answering that as well. But I think we have spoken about lots today, and I know that we could speak about lots more knowing us, but we're going to round off here. And I'm going to round off with the question that I'm asking all guests, which is, for you, what is the role of love in social justice?
It's a difficult question, obviously. And I've found in the last year, when we've been thinking about it more deeply and in a more focused way, it's often easier to define love by what it's not. And so my initial response to you, I don't know if this is a bit of a cheat, is to say it's not about being punitive. I think it's about moving us away from punishment. And I this is related actually to what we were just saying about social media. And I'm not going to call it cancel culture. But what I will say is that it does feel like it's very difficult to make a mistake these days. And this is a huge journey. I think about social justice certainly every day and for most of the day. I hope that's not sounding too righteous. It's just generally how it is. And yet, my knowledge is so small, and I make so many mistakes on such a regular basis. And I have the luxury, I suppose, of being able to do that so regularly, to think about those things. And yet, for something that's so complicated, where there are so few obvious answers to things, it seems like we're in a moment where if you do something wrong, or it's perceived to be wrong because of how it's been presented, maybe on social media or whatever, that's kind of it for you. Or at least that for me, there is that fear. And I think what I'm circling around here is accountability. I think there's something around accountability and love. I think love introduces a certain framework for accountability, perhaps in social justice, where you are holding people responsible for words and actions. You know, you're not just letting every mistake go, but I think you're also holding someone in account in such a way that they are allowed to continue their journey. And I'm not thinking of anything specific when I say that. Just trying to move away from a punitive framing where that person is kind of discarded. I think it's too dismissive of any individual. I think it doesn't take into regard how complicated this is. And I think ultimately it's unhelpful, because I don't know how many people are going to end up at the end of this journey if you're written off every time you make a mistake. So I don't know if that amounts to much of an answer, but I think that's what love introduces to social justice. It introduces an accountability measure that I think is ultimately going to be more progressive, and is going to help us better achieve what we want in terms of securing justice. That's what I think.
Thank you for sharing that, Alex. I've said elsewhere that love should be the highest KPI. That's the measure. And so, yeah, that really resonates. And thanks for coming on, being the first guest in this series as well.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed chatting to you.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.